Good evening, everyone. Hi, I'm Richard Weiss. I'm the president of the Explorers Club, and welcome. I always like to know my audience, so who here is for the first time? Oh my gosh, there's a lot of you. All right, so I'm gonna give you a little context of where we are. I always say that the Explorers Club is like Hogwarts for adults. And the reason I say that is I remember the very first time I came here in the 1980s. I was not yet a member, and I went by the members lounge, and it had a rope, that sort of velvet rope across it. And I could hear somebody talking about Amazonian spear tips. And then I heard another guy walking in space, about walking in space. And I was like, who are these people? And so when you come here, it's just incredible. You name any place on Earth, and someone's going to say, oh, did you see this or that or eat there, or I know so-and-so there. And you think they're name dropping, but it's just how we have conversations. So it's honestly, it's a crazy place. I'd also be remiss without introducing somebody who's very special, and because, well, it sounds kind of like a British accent, but it's actually more South African or a Zimbabwe accent. We have Fania Rose, the first woman president of the Explorers Club. You know, and I think so fitting for tonight's talk about the Royal Observatory, a lot of the artifacts within this room are from the UK. For example, that wood behind you is called linen fold wood. It's from the 17th century. It's all hand carved. I know that we have some of these stained glass windows are actually from Windsor Castle. Downstairs in the members lounge, I think there's a chair from there as well. So, you know, our roots with British explorers run really all over the place. Okay, we have a few housekeeping things. So one of the wonderful things I always say is, how do we communicate science? You know, we have writers, we have storytellers, and I think that there's so many ways in which we describe the world we live in. There's 5,000 languages that are spoken. There's universal languages like music, art, dance. But recently, we've added another language to that, and that's poetry. And you know, we've enjoyed how poetry adds just sort of that light step and touch to any situation. We have our resident poet laureate for the Explorers Club, Leonard Levy. Leonard, please stand up. And it's quickly becoming a tradition that Leonard, on various occasions, good and bad, deaths of famous explorers, and also occasions, will write a poem. So because I have, you know, and I apologize to our British audience, I have an American accent. I don't speak English, and I know all of you English people, it's sort of like this, it's right. It's that, you know, it's that grating thing. And I don't feel I would do Leonard's poem as it was intentionally written. So to present the poem, we have Lucy Cook. Please welcome Lucy Cook. Lucy, come here to the lectern.
A tribute to the Royal Observatory Greenwich at 350 by L.M. Levy, Poet Laureate of the Explorers Club. In 1675, by royal decree, King Charles established on this sacred place a nexus for advanced astronomy, and Greenwich thus became where stars were traced. 3 centuries and 50 years steadfast, where Flamsteed's first had mapped the night sky view, where Halley's brilliant work was unsurpassed, and GMT became a standard true. Here, Maskelyne refined the stellar ways, and Airy set meridians with care. Discoveries which brightened future days, explorers all, their work beyond compare. And they described the great and grand design. They tracked the stars, the spheres, the solar flight, a universe in motion, most divine, infinity eternal in their sight. The Royal Observatory, standing proud where starlit science shattered doubt and dark, 350 years, a quest unbowed to lead humanity's advancing arc.
I curse my parents for making me grow up on Long Island where, you know, we dropped the valves things. That was really beautiful. So, you know, tonight we're going to have a conversation about a place that just plays such a role in our history. Before the lecture, I was talking to our two guests about, you know, how this all works. I'd mentioned that I had skied to the North Pole, and when you're up there trying to do celestial navigation, was mind-boggling because not only was the sun circling around us, but the ice was also shifting. And I'm like, how the hell did these people do this? I mean, you know, it's one of those amazing things. But, you know, think about what this world was in terms of navigation, of exploring, of getting from one place to another. It wasn't just a matter of pride or having a line that goes through your country that's 0 or Greenwich Meridian line. It's really became an amazing story of science and achievement. So to introduce our two speakers, I almost, because this light keeps flickering out, I thought I was going to say Roger Moore, and you all would have been very excited. Sorry, but we have Robert Moore, and Robert will do the introductions. And as he introduces them, I would like our speakers to come be seated and meet your audience.
Thank you, Richard.
Yeah.
Well, it was at the 11th hour and 11th minute that I was asked to make the introductions. And it is indeed an honor and a privilege to be standing here at this podium. I've been a member of the club since 2004 when Richard was also president. So it's all your fault. You signed off on my membership. But that was our centenary year. And I never thought in my wildest dreams I'd be standing at this podium. But it is such an honor and privilege to introduce our esteemed speakers. I'm on the board of the American Friends of the Royal Museums Greenwich, and I'm a patron. So I've been spending quite a bit of time out in Greenwich, England, for a number of years. So with that, I would like to first read the bio of Patty Rogers, a very brief bio. He's been the director and CEO of the Royal Museums Greenwich since 2019, overseeing a world-renowned collection, and I can attest to that. That includes the National Maritime Museum, the Royal Observatory, this year being the 350th anniversary, the Queen's House, Indigo Jones architectural house, just amazing. Our houses our art collection, and the Cuddy Sark. He's the former CEO of NAV, the world's largest independent tanker company, and he brings decades of maritime industry experience. He also is a younger brother of Trinity House, a liveryman of the Shipwrights Company, and a freeman of the City of London. And we also have Dava Sobel. She's an acclaimed American science writer known for making complex scientific topics accessible and engaging for general audiences. A former New York Times science reporter, she's best known for her best-selling books. In England, we'd say Longitude. Here, we say Longitude. Galileo's Daughter, The Glass Universe, and more, which frequently blend historical narrative with scientific discovery. Sobel's work often highlights the human stories behind scientific advancement, particularly those involving overlooked contributors, including women in science. With that, I'd like to welcome them to the podium. And if you could all put your phones on silent.
Thank you, Robert. And just before I'm seated, Robert, you mentioned this lectern. You know, the hands that have been on this lectern are really the hands of giants. I've seen Neil Armstrong's hands here. I've seen Jane Goodall's hands. I've seen Buzz Aldrin. I mean, I can keep going down the list of great people who've spoken here. So if these walls could talk, wow, a lot of stories. And, you know, both of you are going to participate in a tradition of storytelling. Ever since we came out of trees or caves, and my relatives more recently than others, we've told stories. So let us begin. And Patty, let's boxed water here. I don't know what you're supposed to do with it, but if you...
I'm very excited by it.
Yeah, It's a keepsake for our speakers. So, Patty, take us. 1675. What happened?
So, 1675. I suppose all of these things have a slow start, but 1675, as many of you will know, was the year that the Royal Observatory, the building was commenced, and the cornerstone was laid by Charles II in August of 1675. Why 1675? Well, one of the critical things that had happened, all of the big moves had happened earlier, but they had such a slow and long influence that momentum was picking up. And the first big move, of course, was Christopher Columbus and the discovery of the Americas, because now there was a reason to cross a big ocean. And of course, it took a long time for that to really become this economic powerhouse, which began to shift and change human interaction. So that was one big thing. The other one was a simple fact, and it's always worth remembering this, that telescopes save lives, right? Because Giordano Bruno had posed a heliocentric solar system, but all he had to go on and evidence his theory was maths. So they burned him at the stake. But Galileo, of course, had a telescope, and he could point at the Jupiters of moon, and the moons of Jupiter, sorry, and he could simply say, explain that to me then. And of course, he just got life imprisonment and the perpetual threat of torture, something that everybody in the United States today is completely unfamiliar with. But the critical bit of this, you've suddenly got the technology, and you've suddenly got the need. And then you need the occasion. And the occasion for Britain was, of course, the fact that we'd had a civil war. Now, in the Civil War, we had Oliver Cromwell had also acquired and through war Jamaica. So we suddenly had a stake, and the Civil War also displaced the royal family. So Charles I lost his head, but Charles II ended up in a kind of extended gap year, you know, like the students have when they just doss around the world for a year or two. But his was 10 years. There was a decade of sleeping in relatives' sofas and begging accommodation. And the place that he wound up and spent a lot of his time in was Versailles. And when he came back, I mean, the Stuarts, I mean, the Tudors were mean, you know, they didn't really like spending. They were savers and hoarders, but the Stuarts, once they became king, they really wanted to live it up. They definitely wanted to have the good life. They knew how to spend it. That was part of the problem of Charles I. But Charles II, very much in the same vein, had seen Versailles, and he knew that that was the way that a king should live. Also, it kept him away from the city, which had been so unkind to his father. So when he arrived back in the UK, and I always have this image of him and his brother James II with the same bent. They're coming down the Thames from Holland, where they'd embarked. And I always think, you imagine they're ripping, ready to really get into the Royal Treasury, spend some money, live it up, and show people what a king should be like. And I'm sure that the music that played as that boat came down the Thames was Thin Lizzy and The Boys Are Back in Town. So the work starts almost immediately, and the center of that work is, of course, the house of beauty and delight that their mother had been so important and influential in finishing, which was the Queen's House, designed and constructed by Inigo Jones, started in 1616 as a mollifying gift from James I to his wife, Anne of Denmark, because he had publicly berated her, and he had to apologize. So she really made him pay for it. And the first neoclassical building in Britain was built in the center of the Tudor Palace at Greenwich. So that really becomes the home of why they center on this place. And of course, when they get there and they start the Versailles work, they get Le Notre, he's the gardener from Versailles, and he comes and reshapes Greenwich Park. They get Christopher Wren, and they commission him for a huge palace, which of course you can see today as the World Heritage Site, the UNESCO protected World Heritage Site that is Maritime Greenwich, and made that because we have a unique construction of buildings from the 1616 Inigo Jones Queen's House through Christopher Wren's Flamsteed House and Christopher Wren's Royal Palace, and indeed the Nicholas Hawksmoor Church at St Alphege. But 100 years of Baroque architecture, and all undamaged by the war, and still in this sort of really unicum of architectural experience. But what do you need on top of the urgency of trade? You definitely need to outdo your cousin, Louis XIV. And Charles had a French mistress who cheekily pointed out that there was a Frenchman in town saying that the French had discovered longitude, or the exact calculation of longitude, and that the reason they were so advanced was because Louis XIV had an observatory. And so the occasion of the return, 1675, it was 15 years afterwards. He had had some trouble on the way, the Black Death and the fire in London. But by 1675, he was ready for it. The palace was up and running, and it was time to make sure he outdid his cousin. And so he built the observatory on the hill. And the rest, they say, is history.
Wow. So now that they've built this, and maybe we can talk a little about what was the technology had to be right at that time. So when you wrote Longitude, what was the first thing that sort of comes to mind in terms of timing of 1675, and what could they find at that point, or could they have changed?
It is really sobering to realize that all those explorers didn't know where they were. I mean, Columbus thought he'd found the Indies, and they had no way to determine their position at sea. I'm just curious, since we're at the Explorers Club, how many of you have determined your position without looking at a GPS unit?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Shadow.
So the principle of determining longitude had been understood since the 1500s, but nobody had a means to do it. So people understood that if you knew what time it was, where you were, and at a place of known longitude, you could determine your position. But that would require either an encyclopedic knowledge of astronomy, which was the reason for building an observatory, to chart the stars and really have the data to solve this problem, or you could develop a timekeeper, a way of determining time where you are, which you can do from the heavens, but how do you know what time it is back home? That was the problem. How do you build a clock that will keep the home port time while you are out on the open ocean? And that was considered the least likely solution to the problem until John Harrison came along and actually built a clock that would work on a boat.
So in terms of, Patty, the observatory, what was the moment that changed the world at that observatory? Was there a moment?
Well, I think there is a critical point, which the two methods that were being looked at for determining longitude during the Great Debate, and the reason that they needed an observatory is that they were clear that for them a clock was the celestial clock of the heavens, and that this was what you were going to use to determine longitude. Why? Because it's there and it's reliably there. And all the clocks would lose or gain time and were completely unreliable. Clocks could be used for maintaining time during the day or time during the week, so that you could shoot your position and set a clock off that position, and that would continue to give you the time that you needed. But was it going to be reliable? So the lunar distance method was always being used essentially for the same way as a clock would be used. What is the time here relative to the time somewhere else? So we can say that, and I hope you'll forgive me with so many excellent navigators here, but what I have to deal with in our daily work is people who say to us things like, "Weren't you lucky to discover that the meridian went through Greenwich?" You're
God,
laughing.
that was my next question right here.
So the other one is somebody, and trust me, a lot of reporters, and as a result of reporters, a lot of scientists will say it because they're told it's the way that you educate people, is to say that the Prime Meridian is the north-south equivalent of the equator, which is just insane. I mean, what we understand, of course, as wise and wonderful people, is that, and it goes very much to what you were saying in your introduction, lines of latitude are circles. And if you're, and this is one of the great things we'll come to later, no doubt, in education when we lose the clock face. But when we talk about longitude, we're not really talking about lines of longitude. We're just saying, on a given latitude, where am I on this circle? And the time will tell me where I am on this circle on a differential of where I am from a known time and a known place, with every hour of time being 15 degrees of longitude on the basis of 360 degrees in a circle and 24 hours in a day. And if you can think of it like that, then of course the question is only, okay, it's belling the cat, I've got the answer, but how do I make the calculation? And that struggle never really ends. And I would even dare to say it hasn't ended yet, because on the face of it, a solution comes with a clock so reliable that you don't need to keep doing lunar tables. And the lunar tables have so many problems in them in terms of the amount of skill you need, the number of calculations you have to have made, and the conditions have to be right, because as soon as you're making observations, you're back in the weather problem. So there was never really going to be a clear-cut winner, but in the end, the weight just begins to stack up, that the one that's the most effective and convenient ends up being the one that's the most the one that becomes the most replicatable for the speed at which you, and the volume at which you're trading. So there's no one point when it's over, but the big argument, of course, is that if you're just doing it as a scientific experiment for Hooke and Newton and Flamsteed, then complicated maths isn't the issue. Replicatability of that mathematical thinking or of the calculations isn't an issue. But if I want thousands, today there are probably 60,000 merchant ships that cross the world at any given time, they're in journeys, are you going to find this volume of people who can do the maths reliably and shoot the positions? It's all about the knowledge and the technique. Or you go to something which is much simpler, a bit rougher, but absolutely replicatable and ownable in the technology of having a clock.
So, well, and it would be remiss of me not to mention that our main sponsor here, Rolex, has a perpetual motion clock that is accurate within thousandths of a second for as long as your arm moves. So just a little sidebar there. David, you know, when they started, I mean, when was that acceptance of this? Because with everything, there's trial and error, and people didn't get it right away.
Yeah, well, I was thinking when you first asked the question, it wasn't a moment, it was decades. Harrison himself worked decades on these machines until he finally was able to build something small enough that would really be convenient to take on a ship and not need a big glass enclosure to protect it from the water. Ships at that time really didn't have room for the large machines that he built at first. But he learned to miniaturize, and his own clock would have been very difficult to replicate. And that was one of the arguments against it, that it was so complex that it could not be easily mass-produced. But others came along who could simplify the design. Thomas Earnshaw especially, whose design held for more than 100 years. And in just thinking of what you said about how the argument between the two is never really resolved.
Finished, no.
But the GPS system is really the perfect marriage of the rival systems from the 18th century, because it works on a network of satellites, so we could think of those as man-made stars, and then they're broadcasting time signals from atomic clocks. So I love thinking what the Board of Longitude would have thought of that solution to the problem. That was the august body that was to judge all the proposals and decide which one won the huge monetary purse that was offered, because this problem was overwhelming and had gone on for so long. It was thought that an early version of the X Prize would flush out an answer. And it did.
I just want to touch on that, because I think there's another great story which echoes through to modern times. So Flamsteed is nothing if not diligent and terribly enthusiastic for the task ahead of him, because when the observatory is being built, he was already on site and taking readings from the roof of the Queen's House. So he was itching to get going, and he got going. And of course, he started this enormous catalogue. And Newton, who wasn't always empathetic, was constantly telling him, look, you're a plodder, man. Just give me the data that you're working on, and I'll make some sense of it. And that argument was so poorly put that, of course, there was no cooperation between them. But in 1712, in what feels like a very modern thing, like data scraping or the theft of somebody else's work, the way that we see it being argued and talked about, whether it's from TikTok all the way through to secret computer chip components in cranes that are built in China for use in US ports, Newton lifts the data, and together with Halley, they publish the catalogue, a slightly rough version of it, because it was what they could get their hands on. And Flamsteed and then his widow set about buying every copy and burning it. But this kind of data war is about a fundamental opinion about the way good science is conducted. You know, Flamsteed felt that it was about comprehensive data collection and complete mapping. And Newton was clearly of the opinion that it's about testing theories. And when you have enough data to test a theory, you need to do that. And you need to do it as soon as possible. As the bystander to that argument, who might have been less interested, the Admiralty Board are thinking, well, hang on a minute. We set this bunch up in 1675 to come up with the goods on longitude. And here we are, the best part of 40 years later. And the catalogue of the stars that was the basis of the almanac that was going to be used for the lunar distance method hasn't even been published. And so you see government stepping in the form of the Admiralty Board with a prize money, like some modern game show, to say, guys, can you get on with this? This is government intervention in infrastructure to stimulate the market. And so they come in and say, here's a whacking sum of money, let's get this solved. Because we've been 40 years and we haven't even published anything yet.
So I'm going to open it up to questions very shortly, because I really want to impress you two on how intelligent our audience is. I'm not kidding. So I know we have, Leonard, I see you busy, writing away. No, just what you have to do tomorrow, right? Yeah, exactly.
Another poem.
Yeah, but we are here celebrating 350 years. Give us, both of you, sort of contextualize what it has meant to humankind and to science, and to really making the world a better place. So, Patty, you want to start with that one?
Well, there's no question, to my mind anyway, that this was the great leap forward for British merchant shipping and the naval tradition in Britain. And I would say that we weren't a great seafaring nation. I think not compared to the Greeks or to Polynesians, but this sort of technological jump in being able to know exactly where you are was a cutting edge in the development of Britain's competitive advantage in the establishment of a maritime empire. And you'll see that in Harrison's clock is eventually accepted, I think, in 1759, Deva.
That's when he built the last one.
That's when he built the last one, and of course that's the annus mirabilis of the defeat of the French in Canada. That's the reason why you're all speaking English and not French. And of course the Battle of Plessis Fields and the start of the of Britain's Indian Empire. So there's this really big, far-reaching consequence is Britain's global maritime presence. Now that may be for good or for evil, but there's no question that this is a huge technological advantage, and world trade is going to boom. So that it's the start of real globalization, and not hugging coasts, not land transport, but really using the sea, which is 70% of the Earth's surface, as the most efficient form of transport. And then, of course, science, research, exploration in detail, all of it dependent on this. The Challenger expedition, 2 years of oceanographic studies. None of this would have happened without the work that had been done. But along the way, of course, loads of technological developments off the back of the fundamental science.
But Patty, so they could have closed up shop. They solved the problem. You have another 300 years of greatness. So not to rest on the laurels of Longitude, which is quite miraculous. What were some of the other cutting-edge science that was conducted there?
Well, of course, the whole of the Earth sciences, I think the astronomers were always worried they were going to run out of work, but they never did. So magnetism, meteorology, and gravity. Eventually, the observatory, in terms of a research institute, is defeated by the environmental conditions of being in an ever-burgeoning big city. All of those studies required sensitivity around magnetism, or whether it's around observable sky, and all of them showed that the observatory was in a very difficult place to continue. But the one thing that we have been able to do, which is critical, we've gone back to doing research. We have an active telescope, and we recently had the discovery and the tracking of an exoplanet around a distant star from the observatory, which is great news to be back doing that. But in the meantime, we're involved in a public education, and with visitors to the museum at a total of about 2.9 million and about a little bit under 1 million for the observatory, our job is to get fundamental structural frameworking thinking into the visitors' minds, so that when they accrete knowledge, they have a place to put the content that develops in their minds to expertise and knowledge, not just to information holding. And that's a continuing task for us, and a really valuable one.
And when you visit the observatory, you understand that this is where it happened, and you can actually see the tools, and it moves people. You yourself said you had to take the obligatory picture with 1 foot in each hemisphere, and people know that time really belongs to Greenwich. I was recently at the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, and there's a person there who calls his project H6. And he's trying to find ways for the military to have precise time when they cannot access the GPS signal. So it goes back to Harrison.
And you know, look, Britain did something very strange, which was to leave the European Union. It was very strange, and the impact of it was extremely far-reaching. So we lost access to the European network of satellites for global positioning. We have a negotiated agreement with the American government which does not allow us to get precise data. We get averaged and reduced data. We'll be given full access in the event of a national emergency. Britain is now trying to build back its own satellite presence. But all of these satellite presences, so you can depend on global positioning data, but don't forget, somebody owns that, and maybe it's not always going to be available to you. And in I think it was 1859, the Carrington event, huge solar expulsion of plasma, and if that event was repeated today, and if satellites weren't prepared by moving them out of the position they're in to ensure that they're not in the path of that storm, they will be destroyed, not interfered with, but destroyed to the point where you would have to build a new one and put it back up there. If that happens, what's going to happen to your relationship with your position, location, your understanding of where you are? Because your Waze, your Google Maps, they're all gone. And that's potential any moment. So it's something to think about.
Well, I'm going to give you a story to think about. And I mentioned at Explorers Club, you get great stories. And so I'm going to name drop. 2019, I was taking a ride back to Al Worden in Apollo 16, was it, you guys? Apollo 16 astronaut said to me that when he was leaving the moon, which is always a great way to start the conversation, is that he was afraid that they would lose electrical power similar to Apollo 13. All the coordinates that NASA had given them to get home from the moon would be lost, and adrift they would go. He said without telling NASA, he decided that he would use celestial navigation outside his 8-inch window to find his trajectory back home. That's pretty darn good knowledge. I mean, doing it at a stationary place is one thing, but doing it with two celestial bodies moving through an 8-inch window, I said to him, there must be a record for goosebumps, because I just got them. So do we have any questions out here in the audience? Right there?
Well, sure. I started off my career at the... Oh, thank you. I started off my career at the Naval Observatory doing astrometry. So I can definitely relate to the history of the Greenwich Observatory. And if nothing else, out of a little bit of provincialism, having been on the U.S. side of timekeeping, I'd love to hear about the relationships between the U.S. and Britain as the observatory developed, and maybe even some of the other countries in the world.
Well, the first and most important thing to say about our relationship with the US is that the reason that we have the Prime Meridian in Greenwich is down to the USA. So in the conference and in the 1880s, because we talked a little bit about why you might need a meridian, but of course, a coordinated time became critical on a national basis in Britain, but on an international basis in Europe for organisation of train timetables, so that you could all be on the same time or understand the relationship of time, so that you could schedule the movement of trains. But that was early in the 19th century. But by the end of the 19th century, once the telegraph had been invented and globalized trade was being financed globally, you needed an agreed time stamp so that you could ensure the time value of money. And so that conference, which took place in Washington, was right. What are we going to agree on? And of course, the French said, well, there's no question, Paris is the zero meridian. And no doubt others threw their hats into the ring. But I must say, the story of the observatory is often a story of competition with France. But it was the Americans who intervened and said, look, we're all using Admiralty charts. And everybody has got them on board their ships and is using them for their passage routing. So what we're not going to do is change them all. So I'm afraid, whether you like it or not, it's not Paris, it's Greenwich. So that's how we ended up with Greenwich as the Prime Meridian. And thank you very much. I always thought it was a bit like the VHS Betamax argument. Both perfectly good systems, but the one that was in distribution earliest was the one that ultimately succeeded. So thanks to the Admiralty, but thank you, USA.
I think we had a question up front here. Yep. Use the microphone, Felix.
Thank you. It's been a long time since I read Longitude. I think it was soon after it came out. But what I came, one of the things I came away with was how hard Harrison worked on building his clock, and how diligent and tireless he was in doing it, and how frustrating it was for him to receive his commission, his reward. And I never really understood what the resistance was in giving him his reward after all that hard work, because he demonstrated that it worked, clearly. And I couldn't figure out if it was a challenge to the accuracy of the clock, that someone didn't believe it, or it was just prejudice, or what was the reason that he had to wait so long to receive his reward?
The act that declared the contest said that the solution had to be practicable and useful. And his clock was so complex that a lot of people thought, what good is one perfect watch going to do the whole Royal Navy? So it wasn't easily replicated. That was one reason. When the book came out, and you can tell me if this is true, people told me that there was a prejudice against Harrison because he was not part of the establishment. He came from the West Country.
No,
He was not,
Lincolnshire was even worse.
even worse, okay. And he was not, he had no academic affiliation. Who was this fellow? So there was that too.
I think there's undoubtedly, there are a couple of things there, because I think there's definitely and there always is when you go to, with the British are terrible at class issues, you know. So I can imagine that he was frowned on from not being the right sort. But that's a bit of a dilemma, quite frankly, I think, because at least Harrison came up with a solution that admirals could work through, you know, which was just check the time. Whereas the lunar distance tables might have been a bit challenging intellectually for the children of the upper class that were going to become admirals of the fleet. But I think there was also a problem because, isn't it right, David, that Maskelyne was a bit mischievous about not really giving it the endorsement it needed, and you can't help feeling there's a bit of closed shopism there. That the idea of the observatory was to create lunar distance method.
Right, to come up with an astronomical solution. So a timekeeper solution was not really what they wanted, even if it worked.
Got a question all the way back, Felix.
I should make first two quick comments. One is that.
Wait.
Okay.
Microphone.
Thank you. Today is Trafalgar Day, as many of you probably know. It's the 220th anniversary of the Battle of Trafalgar. And you know, the U.S. Navy Academy at Annapolis began reteaching celestial navigation to the cadets, I think at least 10 years ago, maybe 15, just because they realized they couldn't rely on GPS completely. So I think that, you know, bodes well and really solidifies the need for what you do out at Greenwich. I wondered if you could, there's a lovely photo of the observatory with the red ball. So Patty, I was wondering if you could describe how the red ball worked up there at the observatory.
Yes. So we have a red ball that is on a long pole. So I don't know whether there was a photograph of it on the reel that we had up there, but if you wait, it might pop up. There you go. There's the red ball. So at 1 o'clock, and you'll get this, it has to be 1 o'clock. This red ball is cranked up to the top, and then precisely on 1 o'clock it's dropped. And all the ships, because the big port of London is really here on the river in front of you, all the ships along the river could set their Greenwich chronometer on the basis of the falling ball. So this is not uncommon in train stations as well, and anywhere where the public wanted to reset their watches, because watches ran down, they weren't that effective, but there were a couple of people here who came and set their watches by the time of the falling red ball, and then walked off into the city with a signpost saying Greenwich time for sale, and they would charge people money to set their watches from the watch of the person that had seen the red ball fall. So this is a not uncommon technique for making sure, but what's interesting is, of course, it's 1 o'clock that you drop the red ball, not midday, because midday is the point at which you're going to be measuring the height of the sun locally in order to set the zenith for your local time watch. So your local time watch is done at 12, and your Greenwich time watch, when you see a Greenwich signal, can be done at 1 o'clock. Now, I want to tell you something else that's a great story, because Robin Knox-Johnson is a great friend. You'll know him, I'm sure, as the single-handed round-the-world sailor. In 1968, he completed that Whitbread challenge, or the challenge to circumnavigate. There were no satellites in 1968. And he was setting his position in the Southern Ocean, and he remembers desperately trying to get a radio to work which had wet batteries because he had to get the Greenwich time signal. And he had gone so many days without it that he was frightened that he didn't really know where he was. But that was going to be his critical element to determining his longitude in 1968. And that doesn't seem so long ago to those of us up here, does it?
Just a little correction here, and this is the place to do it. In 1968, they did have satellites. So the first satellites were put in space in the 1950s. So it was communication satellites for everyday people. So this is the kind of ticky-tack stuff we have here. Someone will say, no, that's not where it was there. I used to have these.
But it didn't help him.
Didn't help him. Right? Any other questions in there? Right here.
I loved visiting the Greenwich Observatory, and I have a vague memory, it was a while ago, but weren't the watches and the Swiss music boxes or something related to it? And how did people keep time with the watches after this establishment of what time was? Wasn't there technology with the Swiss or was something? How did people keep the watches?
Yes, but there definitely
talk about
was
that a little bit?
a history of Swiss watchmaking, and there were Swiss scientists also working on solving the longitude problem. But the question was to get a clock that would work on a ship and would not change its rate when the ambient temperature changed. So you want to sail from a cold country of origin to a warm destination, and you have a clock that's mostly metal. How do you keep the parts running steadily? And that was another level, and that was something that Harrison addressed specifically, was how to balance the use of metals so that the rate would stay the same no matter how the temperature changed. That was a major breakthrough.
So he used bimetallic strips of brass and steel. And what's so interesting about that as a technological spin-off, of course, is that this was eventually used initially in the Second World War, I think, because John Taylor, who's a great collector of Harrison's clocks and of clocks generally, he made his fortune. His father initially made the fortune because he invented a thermostatic switch for the bomber crews of British RAF during the Second World War, so that they could have a warm suit that was light and kept them mobile and kept them warm. But they realised that it had to switch off thermostatically, otherwise they'd end up cooking the pilots before they got over Germany. So he invented, and it was based on exactly the same technology that had been developed by Harrison. And then, of course, the family went on to make a fortune after the war because these were installed in your kettles and in all your other thermostatic devices. Very simple. It's just a copy of what Harrison was doing in his clocks.
Will Roseman?
Yeah, it was also, from my understanding, Hamilton, which was an American manufacturer of chronometers, they're often credited with helping America win the war because they were able to make chronometers at a rate that no one else was able to. Yeah. And they also used the isochromatic balance wheel that that was also gimbaled as well, that was really very, very successful.
All the way back. Felix making you run back and forth.
Hi, I haven't had the gift of going to the observatory yet, but I'm putting it on my spring list when I'm back in London. So my question's a little silly. I am, please forgive my ignorance on this, but where does daylight savings fit into all of this, if it does, or if that's just an American thing?
It really doesn't. It doesn't fit with this. And personally, I think it's really silly, and I'm eager for the day we drop it.
I'd love daylight savings time.
Well, we could stay on it all the time and not switch back to standard time. It's the switching back and forth. But yeah, that's a separate issue. That's just about what do you do at what hours of the day and what's convenient for you for when you should call it the start of the day.
That's a great
Yeah.
question. Now I'm going to put you on the spot. Pluto, ninth planet or not?
Oh, I was on the committee that tried to define planet. Yeah, it's not like the other planets, but the real tragedy of that whole debacle was the goal was to define planet so that when astronomers looked at bodies beyond our solar system, they could say, this is a planet. But now the definition applies only to this solar system. So it was a big waste of time.
Can I just say the only reason I think it wasn't a waste of time is it did end up being the subject matter of one of John Prime's best songs about Pluto being deplaneted.
Okay. And it also got people very engaged. There was a lot of discussion, a lot of emotion. I mean, I heard people on the street using terms like barycenter. You know, it was to get people excited about science. Yeah, I'll take that.
All right.
That
While we have you on the subject of science, since you are a writer and you an observer, how has the literacy of humankind, or at least American kind, changed in the last 40 or 50 years?
I don't think I'm a good person to say that. I mean, writers are people who sit alone in a room most of the time.
Come on,
I
you're a New
certainly
Yorker. You already have an opinion.
try to increase science literacy, but I'm frankly horrified at how low the level is.
I think,
And I
yeah.
fear that it will only get lower as
I had an Uber drive the other day where the guy, I don't know how he got on the subject of transgender mice, but I had to correct him and say, they're not making boy and girl mice. They're making, it's two species transgenic. But then he went on to tell me why we didn't walk on the moon, so that was a whole other...
okay.
So it was a
yeah.
good conversation.
Well, I mean, to be honest, when he said we hadn't been to the moon, I said, you're telling this to the wrong person.
Yeah.
I said, I've actually spoken to at least 8 Apollo astronauts who looked me in the eyes and told me, and I said, look, the Soviets were our mortal enemies. If Brezhnev would have thought that there was anything funny, he wouldn't have called up Nixon. So, yes, that was my Uber ride. It was entertaining. We went on a lot of theories, but yeah, that were the two that come to mind.
But this isn't actually a small point. This is a really big point, because this is where we're in the process now in the 350th year of the observatory in redesigning and starting out on this very significant project for the observatory, which is called First Light. But the heart of it is this. We've been teaching astronomy and astrophysics at the site for some considerable time. And in 2007, we added a planetarium, which was really to give the sort of joyous excitement of getting people into space mentally, at the same time as being able to ask questions of an astronomer and get straight answers. And we do some really fun stuff as well, like we would movies like Interstellar get shown, and then afterwards in the planetarium, and then an astronomer will come out and say, okay, let's go through the science. what was ridiculous, what wasn't bad, what's pretty realistic, and just get the audience to engage in that. We've also found that with our audience studies that a lot of people wouldn't, for a day trip to a cultural place, they would never bring their children to the observatory because they would be terrified that they'd be stood in front of a label and their child would ask them what it meant and they wouldn't have a clue. So the critical USP that we want to use, and we continue to use, we use it now, but we're going to expand it, is that when you come on site, you meet someone who knows, and they will engage in dialogue with you, and they will explain to you what the current state of thinking is. And if you ask questions they don't know the answer to, they will say to you, we don't know the answer to that, but we have some ideas, and it could be like this or it could be like that. And trying to get people into a framework where at least they understand what longitude is, what latitude is, why there are seasons, what the obliquity of the ecliptic is, and how that creates seasons, why it's materially significant that you're within the Arctic Circle and what would be different about that, and what would be different about being in the southern hemisphere from being in the northern hemisphere. People really need to know this. They need to know about the habitable zone. They need to know that they are the most fortunate opportunity of anything in existence to have been on the Goldilocks planet, between Venus too hot and Mars too cold, to be on Earth that's just the right temperature. It's Willem Anders in Apollo 8, as they have the Earthrise moment, suddenly saying, we went to the moon to discover the Earth. There are huge, huge lessons to be learned from coming out at night, even after hours in the pub arguing with your friends and drinking beer, to take a moment to look up at the night sky and remember that you're on a planet. And to remember that your life form on this planet is because you're a human being. I don't mind going to the moon. I don't mind that we're collecting rock samples on Mars and that we will bring them home. But don't forget, this is home. Human beings have to live here. And we have to make sure that they're equipped with enough science framework to be able to take information and turn it to knowledge, and to be able to scientifically, in the sense of human beings have the skill of rationality, to be rational in argument, to accept facts, to accept change opinion. If human beings don't do this, and if we don't advocate for this, we will fail, and we will fail the next generations. And that's what we're going to do at the observatory. That's why we're going to spend a very significant amount of money in the next year and a half to deliver a place that's fit for the next 350 years, not necessarily in the most cutting-edge research. But think of this, every time a new person meets a new fact, like some of the discoveries that Flamsteed made, that is a new experience of discovery for that mind. That is a new moment of research, a new moment of wonderment. So we have a job to do, and science and art can come together and make things experiential and joyful, as well as rational, significant, meaningful, and forward-thinking. There's a lot of work to be done in these difficult times.
Wow, you just threw the science gauntlet right down. I appreciate that. And that's what this is about. Before we end, are there any other questions or observations? Anybody want to add to that conversation?
When the observatory was
Wait, hold on.
Sorry. When the observatory was made, Isaac Newton was alive, wasn't he? When the observatory was first made, Isaac Newton was alive, right? And he was writing and exchanging ideas with the Royal Astronomer. Isaac Newton invented the reflecting telescope, essentially.
He did.
Right. What instrument was in the observatory the day it was completed?
So the traditional telescopes that were being used in the first instance were refracting telescopes. So really, that chain from the Dutch first inventing them to look out for ships on the horizon to see what was coming into port, was then refined by Galileo and turned into something capable of seeing the moons of Jupiter, and constant refinement of lens grinding techniques and of size enabled them to get better and better opportunity with a refracting telescope. But William Herschel and Caroline Herschel were almost like that scene in Star Trek where you have warp factor and you suddenly shoot forward, because they go for an enormous reflecting telescope. And there's a wonderful story about that, but it's just that he was an amateur. He was essentially a musician who became a paid astronomer of the royal court. But he polished the mirror by hand. And there's a technique for polishers that they can't break contact with the surface. When they get into their polishing, their hands can feel where it's sticky and where it's smooth and where it's coming to the right level of shininess. So he worked for enormous hours. And Caroline Herschel, who was a brilliant mathematician and a brilliant scientist, fed him by hand whilst he continued the work. Not because she was his little sister feeding her older brother, but because this was a scientific enterprise in which they both understood the significance of a period of 20 hours of unbroken work or whatever it was. And so they worked like this, but what they produced was something which suddenly showed them that there were galaxies out there, that the smudges that they had seen were actually galaxies that could be observed, that Polaris was a bipolar star. So all of this great leap forward, and all down to an enormous reflecting telescope.
But what was Flamsteed looking through?
He
A
was
refractor?
Yes,
was-
a refractor. He only, as far as I'm aware, Flamsteed only really had refractors, and they were. I think there's a picture on here.
There's
of the
an
long
image.
ladder, of the long ladder with the long.
It looks like a Diderot lithograph of them looking through the window,
That's right.
not through a slit in a dome.
No, so this is a great thing that, of course, the architect, although Wren was also an astronomer, he had limited funds to build Flamsteed House, and he built it on the foundations of a prior castle that had been in the hunting grounds of the royal palace, and he didn't quite get the alignment of north, south, east, and west right on the octagon room windows. But the idea was you open the window and you look through the window in the direction of the star. But it wasn't long before Flamsteed was clambering onto the roof of Flamsteed House and then building a garden shed next door, like all good astronomers, and doing his measurements from there. And his first meridian line is not from the octagon room. It's from that garden shed that he'd built next to Flamsteed House.
Is that instrument still surviving in a museum?
Do you know what? We have it on show, but I might suspect that it might not be the original.
Listen, I want to thank the both of you for coming here tonight. Thank you so much. Happy 350th birthday. And if there's ever a reason to go there again, take a new look through a different set of lens of eyes. And thank you for your advocacy of science all these years. Longitude can still be purchased, I'm sure, on Amazon, right?
Yeah, but Amazon is not the only way to buy books, I would just like to say.
Our honorary chair of the Explorers Club is Jeff Bezos.
Nevertheless.
And can I just say that I've just remembered why it's not Flamsteed's telescope, is because his wife sold them all off after he died.
But didn't they provide the instruments? Weren't they his own?
So
Yeah.
the government's generosity went to food and accommodation, but they had to bring their own instruments.
You know, one of the things I love most about the Explorers Club is the engaging conversations on subjects that seem so enlightened and so above the fray of what we see sometimes in the news or on the street. It's just nice to sort of talk obscure, just wandering mind, just all of these things. We have public lectures on Monday nights. For some of you who are not members, please come visit us again. We'll have a little time right now for people to have discussions amongst each other and certainly get to talk to these experts up here. Thank you so much for coming here. You guys were really wonderful.
For coming.
So please mingle.
Thank you. Have you ever seen working? There should be somebody to take these.
I really appreciated what you said about sort of the future of the observatory and science of impacting minds. I wonder if you think that sort of there's a role for citizen science, at least in the near term or far term, or if that's something that